Quaker philosophy evolved into 5 precepts or testimonies. Though some people like the acronym SPICE, I prefer this order: simplicity, integrity, community, equality, and peace, or nonviolence. Somewhere along the way, emphasis on community waned, and interest in equality, often expressed in the form of mindless political agitation and activism, came to dominate the interests of many friends and meetings. I think that such activism is incompatible with community and doesn't serve the testimony of equality in any event. I think today's interest by one of the national Quaker organizations in political activism stems from the award of the Nobel Peace Prize to the Friends General Service Committee and the British Friends Service Council back in 1947. A Nobel Peace Prize is pretty heady stuff, but that award was bestowed on the Quaker community and our unique philosophy. The committees were merely the vehicle. Since that time, the idea of community, like most systems of belief, has eroded here in the West in the post-war era. And I think that erosion is in large part due to the interest in political activism overshadowing the importance of community. If we step back from activism and focus on our testimony of equality, the friends who promulgated the testimonies certainly were not asserting equality of outcome or the rejection of private property rights. Surely, equality wasn't endorsed to disturb or interfere with community. We cannot have one without the other. But the political activism, now masquerading as a perverse impersonation of equality, is an abomination and must be rejected out of hand. Our testimony of equality was the recognition that all people were equal in the eyes of the Creator, not clones of one another. Friends regarded all members of the meetings as ministers of the faith and practice, without regard to gender or ethnicity. Yet members were still recognized for their talents, and the sovereignty of the individual and his efforts, in the form of private property, were intact. Friends are equal before the community in what they may expect from the community and in what the community expects from them, and nothing less, but certainly nothing more. Egalitarianism is the rule, and it helps a great deal if everyone knows what the rules are and what is expected of them, and that the rules and expectations are applied equally. This is the very definition of the Quaker testimony of equality. Thomas Jefferson said, quote, "William Penn was the greatest lawgiver the world has ever produced, being the first, in either ancient or modern times, who has laid the foundation of government in the pure and unadulterated principles of peace, reason, and right." Unquote. The Quaker testimony of peace goes to the very heart of our way of life. The peace testimony defines us, identifies us, and secures us. It is also one of the most counterintuitive ideas that spring forth from our philosophy of rejecting the use of force, violence, and coercion to achieve all moral, political, personal, or material goals. And it is universal. It was this philosophy, this testimony in particular, that inspired William Penn to create the frames of colonial Pennsylvania. There were 3 frames, by the way. And I would assert as one of the greatest political achievements in the history of civilization, and certainly since the Magna Carta, as the precursor to the absolute greatest political achievement, the U.S. Constitution. Without the Quaker testimonies, there is no holy experiment of Pennsylvania, no Philadelphia, no Virginia Declaration of Rights, no American Revolution, no Benjamin Franklin, no Thomas Paine, no Independence Hall, and no U.S. Constitution. For it was the philosophy of the Quakers and William Penn that the individual had rights that existed prior to the establishment of the state and which were not abjured or subjugated by the establishment of the state that gave birth to all of those developments. For the previous 12,000 years of civilization, the common man had no say in his government. This was the gift of the Quaker testimony of peace to mankind, the creation of the United States and the U.S. Constitution. As an aside, of course, men did not get the universal vote for another 100 years, women for another 240 years. Some political special interest groups make a great deal of noise about this, but any critical thinking works out something like this. Men did not have universal suffrage for 98% of the history of civilization. Women did not have universal suffrage for 99.2% of the history of civilization. Give or take. In exchange for that 1.2% time privilege, Men died in droves, violent deaths on the battlefields. And within a relatively short time, they handed that privilege over to the women without a shot fired. Think about that for just a moment. Unfortunately, the peace testimony became adulterated, diluted, infected, and compromised at every turn by the state and those who support authoritarianism. The peace testimony never suggested that the individual is not entitled to his life and his property, or that it was a violation of the testimony to protect oneself. It then follows, and this is going to be hard for some, our peace testimony does not distinguish between what we may do ourselves and what we may hire others, including employees of the state, to do. Conversely, if we find it acceptable and in keeping with our peace testimony for the government to protect us, then it follows that it is not a violation of our testimony to protect ourselves. So here's the critical issue. Any action that violates our philosophy does not become an acceptable action merely because we have hired a government force agent to take actions that we know are wrong and would not do ourselves. I refer to that unfortunate circumstance as violence by proxy. Importantly, it doesn't matter if that government force agent wears a uniform. Might, even the might of a majority, mob rule, does not make right. And yet we have voted away the rights of our fellow man and have committed violence by proxy upon him for political, moral, and personal belief systems and agendas. By accepting this, we have disgraced ourselves. The war on drugs is a violation of our peace testimony. Arresting a woman or a man for prostitution, customer or worker, is a violation of our peace testimony. Abortion is a violation of our peace testimony. Stealing the production of another is a violation of our peace testimony. If you doubt this, I invite you to support your position in an open dialogue under the rules of logic in a reasonable and rational co-examination of the facts. We, as individuals, have rights to live as we choose, free from the violence or the violence of their proxies, of those who wish to impose their moral, political, or personal belief system or agendas upon us. These were the premises upon which the entire Quaker ethical foundation was constructed. Why would our fellow man be willing to shoot, beat, use dogs, torture, and imprison us in violation of these testimonies for actions that are neither violent nor a crime against property, for crimes where there is no victim? And why would we thank them for that service? At our founding, we, the people, and the government did not engage in such violence. What changed? The first step is to get back to the practice of our testimony to peace. And to do that, we must thoroughly examine our premises and then abide by our conclusions. As an aside, there are many wonderful and fulfilling aspects of living a long life, but there are a great many humbling realizations too. It's a funny old world. In an essay I wrote many years ago, I described the human condition as the arrogance of youth, followed by the hypocrisy of age. I think that is a reasonable one-liner on this subject. Nowhere is our hypocrisy greater than in the use of violence and coercion. The generation that protested the American war in Vietnam has been in power in the United States since Bill Clinton took office in January of 1993. For over 25 years. What did this generation do? Did they bring about the peace they so rightly agitated for to the world? It seems to me that as we age, we become supportive of others, the police, the military, Planned Parenthood, the IRS, and other government tax agencies, and the intelligence community, to engage in violence by proxy, to achieve moral, political, and personal agendas. We all know intuitively that using force and violence on our fellow man is evil. Somehow many of us believe the ethical nature of an action improves when we hire a proxy to do the dirty work for us. And there are always people willing to carry a spear for money, status, prestige. And some will do it just for the fun of it. These are the proxies. Failing to reject the violent and coercive activities of proxies is complicity in their activities. Support the war on drugs? Support the war for oil? Support the confiscation of private property to pay off your favorite charity case, or worse, to pay off part of your political coalition? These are all acts of coercion or violence by proxy. We, as individuals, would not commit these acts ourselves. Why would we support policies to have others commit these acts for us? Well, that's a complicated question. We must not fund or support others who are willing to commit acts of violence or coercion for rank, money, a pension, status, or whatever their motivation is for our personal agendas. Please note that the aforementioned does not preclude using violence for self-preservation for the state or self-defense for a human being. It does preclude killing people to keep cars on the road for oil or to prevent them from having peaceful agency over their bodies, drugs, and that requires us to think for ourselves and stop thinking that we need to thank people who got paid every Friday for their service. The next time someone asks you to thank some government career employee for their service, I hope you will keep this in mind. Many people, farmers, fishermen, lumbermen, are doing far more dangerous work to provide for their families. No drama, no pensions, and no thank you for your service. It's not even close. The occupations best defined as willing to carry deadly weapons for the government and use them on their fellow man don't make the top 10 most dangerous occupations. But they do pay a great deal better than the statistically most hazardous occupations, and the participants seem to use the power of the state to demand higher status in the social hierarchy. Here's the thing. If you are called to nonviolence, to reject the use of coercion and force, then you must reject violence by proxy to achieve all moral, political, or personal agendas and outcomes. This is as true for private property and individual agency as it is for sex. Coercion is evil. We can't get a little bit pregnant when it comes to coercion. Of course, rejecting coercion means the acceptance of human nature and all of our foibles, because the definition of foible is subjective, and man is exactly what he was meant to be. The idea that some special interest group can improve on human nature through the use of government coercion is the definition of the hypocrisy of the aged and the arrogance of youth and of evil. This is the end of Chapter 7. Hi, I'm Greg Jeffers, author of the best-selling book, Prosperous Homesteading. I'm an author, writer, blogger, and homesteader. This is my labor of love. My latest novel, 7 Years of Famine, is available now at Amazon. Thank you.